Hello everyone and welcome back. In this video what we're going to do is talk about animation. Now the primary focus of this video will be an introduction to keyframe animation, but I did want to spend just a minute and talk a little bit about two other methods of animation that is available inside of Houdini. Now this is a fundamentals class, so we're not going to spend a significant amount of time on animation. And what I mean by that is basically we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the wealth of tools that are available to you in Houdini to help aid with animation, because there's a lot of stuff, there's a lot of options. We could very easily turn this into an animation course that 3D Buzz put up for everyone to watch or to purchase, whatever it may be. So again, the idea is just to give you a quick introduction to keyframe animation so that you know how you can go about animating parameters in your scene and then turn around and edit the animation curves that are derived from those keyframes. So the first thing I'd like to do is jump over here to the whiteboard and let's spend just a few minutes discussing a little bit about animation. First of all, since this is a fundamental course, I have to assume that some of our viewers are new to 3D and all. So I'd like to begin with a very simple question, and that is, what is animation? You'd be surprised how many beginners that come to the world of 3D are asked, what is animation? And their answer is, well, you know, you see those cartoon characters jumping around, that's animation. Well, that is animation, but what does that mean? What exactly is animation? And then suddenly they think for a second and then they say, movement? Well, okay, yeah, that is animation, but let's get more specific. What is animation? And then that's where they draw a blank. It really is simple. Animation is the change of a parameter value over a given time. And this could be movement. I mean, if we had a character's arm that went from, let's say, shoulder down elbow, so there's his forearm, so we got our wrist, our elbow, a shoulder, and that last shoulder is off a little bit. My pin here is off just by a bit. But let's say that this guy was going to rotate up like such so that the wrist becomes closer to our shoulder. We're going to be rotating around our elbow right there. And let's say that that particular rotation was going to happen around, I'm just going to say X. So rotate X. You would have a rotate X value that would start out with the arm in the position that it is currently. Let's say at something like, maybe it's at 40 degrees or whatever.
Cool.
And then over a given amount of time, that value is going to change from 40 to, let's say, something like, I don't know, 65 or so. And I'm just making up numbers. And now as we scrub our timeline in Houdini, what we would see would be an arm that was going up like such over the time specified. So if we went in here and said that it was going to take 10 seconds for this to happen. So the arm's going to come up real slow. It's a cool cat. He's going to knock his hair back or something. So, let's say it's going to take 10 seconds, then over 10 seconds we will see that movement. Now, of course, we're going to be working with frames, and in just a second we're going to start talking about how do you take 10 seconds and translate that into frames. So for those of you that are already very comfortable with working with animation inside of a 3D application, you see now might be a really good time to kind of fast forward ahead, because I'm going to take it easy on our complete newbies for a few minutes. So what is animation? Animation is the change in a parameter's value over time. It could be something as simple as a rotational value, a translation value to see something actually move forwards, up, down, left, right, whatever. It could be the intensity on a light that's changing. It could be an RGB value that's changing over time so that we see a color shift. It's just a parameter value that changes.
Exactly. It could even be, we've seen custom parameters and how they can drive a whole bunch of things in a network. It
Absolutely.
could be a custom parameter that's animated over time. You could have a huge amount of things going on based on that custom parameter changing.
But in the end, it's a parameter.
Exactly.
And the moment, I'm just going to throw this out here now, and we'll come back to it in a little bit. But we know that on nodes, we have parameters. The moment you apply some animation to a parameter, We now have a channel.
Exactly.
And that animation exists on that channel. And at that point, you can then begin using either word. You know, I'm going to manipulate this channel, or I'm going to manipulate this parameter. But we can delete the channel, which will get rid of the animation.
And we're still left with a parameter
But
when we do that.
we'll always have that parameter. We won't lose the parameter unless it's a custom parameter and you delete it.
Yeah.
All right, so that is what is animation. Now, what types of animation do we have available to us inside of Houdini? I'm just going to put types down. We have 3 different types. We have keyframe animation, we have reactive animation, and of course I'm going to come back to each of these. And finally we have dynamic. Okay, so keyframe animation, reactive animation, dynamic animation. Keyframe animation, what is it? Well, it is us with the ability to basically do a snapshot of a parameter's value at a given time. So a keyframe is created, and that keyframe holds the time in which the key needs to exist and the value of the given parameter being stored in it. So in this particular case, with this example all the way back up here, we would have a keyframe. Let's say that at frame, I don't know, 0, we have a keyframe that has a value of 40. And this keyframe is sitting at, I'll throw him at 0.
Cool.
Okay, so we have a keyframe, and he is for the rotate X parameter on, you know, the elbow node or whatever it may be. So that's a keyframe. Good. Where do we get animation? Because animation is the change in a parameter's value over time. Well, later in time, let's say somewhere around frame 240, rotate X, and actually this is being drawn kind of funny because I'm having us rotate from 40 up to 65, and yet I'm bringing my dot lower. That's because I got stuff in the way, so everybody just...
Change the value of the second rotate X to say...
Let's say we go...
10.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. So...
Cool.
10 goes good. All right, so let's say that once again, rotate X, value, 10, frame. Let's say we're around 240 frames.
Yeah, 240 sounds about
239
good.
later. I'm just going to put 240 down. So 240 frames later, we have another keyframe. So in essence, for this animation, we have 2 keyframes. That's all. Now, kind of like major poses.
Yeah.
Arms down, arms up. Now we have a bunch of tweening taking place in between these 2 keyframes. That's the cool thing about working with animation in a 3D application, and that is the 3D application has the capability of interpolating from one keyframe to the next, and that is what is going to give us some sort of smooth animation. So I'm going to come in here and draw some sort of curve. And that is how we are able to visualize this animation, this tweening between 2 keyframes, and that is through an animation curve. Okay? Now, the animation curve is going to depict a value change over time, and here's what I mean. You guys are going to be working with a channel editor, and in the channel editor, you're going to more or less see a graph. And we're going to have a value representation on the left side, and we're going to have a time representation on the bottom. And take a look at how this works. As time progresses forward, our value is doing what? It's decreasing, 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 starting to kind of mellow out, into the value it needs to be in by frame 240. Okay? Now, we have the ability to control that curve. We have that ability through tangent handles on our keys. So here is a close-up of a keyframe. This keyframe we already know has a value. I draw them as circles. You guys are going to see them as more or less like tick lines when we are working inside of Houdini. And you're also going to see a box around it, attaching our handles, all sorts of good stuff. But we're going to see little handles come out. that we're going to talk about very shortly on how we can work with. And we can tie these handles together, we can break them apart and manipulate them individually, but they allow us to control the curve coming into the key itself. So if I was to take this handle and move it way up, like such, what we would end up seeing would be, let's say we had a curve that was coming in straight. Now we would have just influenced the curve to come in much steeper, okay? Because we're going to start weighting it, or we're going to start, pulling it up. If we pull it out, we're going to start weighting it. And again, we'll get to see all of that coming up soon. Now, I don't want to jump too far off track at the moment because, of course, I'm starting to get in a little bit more with the whole tangents and everything else. I just want you to understand that with keyframes, all it is a simple snapshot of a parameter value at a given time. And it's with 2 or more keyframes, but we have to have at least 2, that we can then generate animation, the change of the value over time. We have an animation curve, and with that curve, we have the ability to control the shape of the curve, which in essence is just controlling how that parameter changes. Is it going to speed up, slow down, etc., as it changes value over time?
And that control is incredibly important. You're going to, on a decent quality animation, spend a lot of time tweaking and controlling your curve because that's going to define how the animation takes place between your keyframes.
That's right. Now, the next type I want to talk about, so I'm just going to come over here, put a little check mark by keyframe. Cool. Next one's going to be reactive animation. So what are we talking about when we say reactive animation? Well, you guys have already seen it, where we took one channel, or excuse me, one parameter, and we copied that parameter and we pasted it onto another parameter. Then what happened is, as one parameter changed, it caused another parameter to change automatically, or it caused that other parameter to react to its value change, the first guy. So I could have, if I wanted to, created a slider for our arm. So here's a little slider, meaning this slider is connected to a custom parameter. So we could have called it arm rotation if we wanted to. Going from, let's say, looking at the values that we've given, 50 to 5. And then as we come in here and adjust this, we could have copied this parameter and we could have pasted that parameter on the rotate X parameter, and then we would not have had to have set a keyframe ourselves. We'd have a channel, but a channel that we're influencing through this expression, because in essence that's what we're dealing with. So when you're working with reactive animation, it's generally just a bunch of expressions that you're putting down, and those expressions can take into account other parameters. We can also react to things like a frame change. So as our timeline is, or as our time slider, is playing forwards, we could have that driving something else in the scene. Reactive animation. Now we're not going to spend much time with reactive animation in the Houdini fundamentals class because once again it's just about fundamentals. But you've already seen some reactive animation, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more, but not much. Now dynamic animation, I think we're going to show them one or two very simple things in Houdini just so that they are at least familiar with the DOPs. But dynamic means that we're now dealing with a simulation system inside of Houdini. We have the ability to take objects and have those objects mimic real-world objects where we can give them a mass and we can set where their center of gravity is and we can give them friction and things like that. And then we can put in fields. We can put in things like gravity, and we can simulate wind. We can have objects collide with one another. We could set all of these things up inside of Houdini and then just hit play. And a solver will take into account all of the parameter values that we have set up to describe these items, and it will calculate through a simulation how these objects should move. Go ahead.
And particles as well are a form of dynamic animation because they simulate from one frame and we move forward in time, working out how we've changed based on where we are currently and all of the forces involved in the current simulation.
So simulations are really cool. It's just neat that we can take a sphere, we can take a ground floor, and we can say, all right, let's apply some gravity to the scene. We can even mimic real-world gravity, and then we can hit play, and we can watch our sphere fall, and bounce. Then we can start hitting it with some forces and watch it bounce and roll away. And that's really cool. And that's very simple stuff. We can start using constraints, and we can start creating very complex animations that are all driven by a solver through a simulation. So again, we're going to provide a very quick introduction to DOPS in Houdini in the fundamental course, and we will be exploring it in greater depth later at 3D Buzz. Okay, so from there, the next thing that I would like to talk about is when coming up with an animation, you really need to spend a minute at the beginning and think, what is your target media? Okay, this is really important. Are you creating an animation for film? Are you creating an animation for television? Over in the United States, might be in TSC. We might be visiting other people abroad.
In the UK, it's
PAL,
PAL, which again
we'll talk
is
about,
different from NTSC.
Are you generating for a game that has been set at a very specific frames per second? There's so, are we doing for the web? Are we creating for flash animation? I mean, there's all sorts of different possibilities, but why is this important? This is important for this. FPS, frames per second. I'll throw it in there. Frames per second. Okay. Seconds. Whatever. What does this mean? This means how many frames will it take to cover 1 second of animation? Well, you might think to yourself, if you're new to the whole world of animation and 3D applications, that, well, that's pretty simple. It is simple, but it's different with all of these different media. So when working with film, it's 24 frames per second. When working with NTSC, we're dealing with 29.97. And a lot of people just round it up to 30 frames a second. When working with PAL, it's 25 frames per second. With game engines, it can vary. It could be 16, it could be 30. It just depends on how the particular engine is handling animation.
Exactly.
Oh,
that's what I was going to say. That's what I was going to mention. It's engine specific.
That's right. So now, why is this important? Well, up here, we saw in this example that we wanted an arm to rotate over 10 seconds. All right? Well, 10 seconds, depending on how many frames we're dealing with, we're going to come up with different numbers. We'd come up with 240 frames required for 10 seconds right there, excuse me. Right here, we would come up with 300 frames. I'm rounding up to 30 frames a second. 300. Now, I won't keep multiplying out. I'm sure everybody can follow along with what I'm doing, but there's a big difference between 240 and 300 frames. So setting your target frames per second is important, which means you need to know ahead of time, all right, what am I creating this animation for? Now, don't let that scare you in that if you start off with 24 frames per second and you want to change it over to 30, it can be changed.
It can be changed, but you're going to find that your animation may not look as nice and as perfect as you wanted it.
It's going to require tweaking.
Oh, yeah.
Lots of tweaking, especially if there's lots of animation. So once you have decided what your frames per second is going to be, the next thing that I like to tell beginners to ask themselves is how long? I mean, the bottom line is this. You shouldn't begin an animation unless you're just learning with no clue of what it is you're going to animate and how long. I mean, you don't just sit down and say, all right, I'm going to have this character do stuff. There's some planning involved. You know, what's he going to do? Is he just going to be sitting there at a table, sipping on some coffee and slowly turning a newspaper page? Fine. If that's the case, get a stopwatch, sit down and act it out. And while you're acting it out, time how long it takes for you to do it. So plan the scene in your mind. Once you've planned it, act it out. See how long it takes. Because we need to go in there and we need to set the length of the animation that we're going to be working with. Once again, if we find later on that the animation length needs to change, it's not a problem. We can easily add frames in or take frames away. But depending on how that's going to affect your overall animation can lead to additional work. You could find yourself in there tweaking if you actually have your keys get scaled, get compressed in or stretched out. If we just need to add frames and we don't want to affect everything, that's very easy. You just go in there and say, all right, instead of 240 frames, I decided I need 600 because I'm now doing a very small animated short and I need lots of extra time. And Houdini will ask you, do you want to stretch out all of your animation curves? You just tell it no. Now you've got a lot of extra time and none of the curves that you've put down have been messed with. So that's good stuff. Okay, so basically, where do we get to all of these different things that I'm pointing out right here? So when we start talking about our frames per second and how long is the animation going to be, this is where we're going to be looking, and we'll show you this in just a few minutes. We're going to be working with a dialog. That's our global animation options. All right. So global animation options will allow us to set a lot of high-level animation parameters available to us at a scene level. So dealing with our scene, such as what is our frames per second, playback, how's that going to be handled? Are we going to play every single frame if we're in real-time mode? Are we going to just start skipping frames if we need to keep up with things? What's the duration, our start frame or end frame? Again, all high-level parameters that really just affect the overall scene as a whole. And we'll be taking a look at that in just a few minutes. So let's see. I do want to mention one more thing. When dealing with keyframe animation or reactive animation, we do have the ability to have objects travel along paths, meaning we can, let me go ahead and just kind of scroll down for you guys just a little bit here. We can put a curve in place, and then we can create an object, and we can tell that object to use the curve as a motion path, and then we can specify a starting and ending, basically traveling along this whole thing as a 0 to 1 type thing, and you can think of that as 0 to 100. So look at it as a percentage. But we can then animate the parameter here going from one value to another, and the animation could look as simple as 0 to 1. So over a given amount of time, we have traveled from start to end. Or we could do crazy things like, go halfway forward and slow down a little bit, then start going backwards, then kind of hold it, then quickly snap to the end. Again, we have all of these controls, these abilities right at our fingertips. So let me erase this stuff out. Steve, as far as basics are concerned, is there anything else you want to add before I start talking about what a channel editor is and stuff like that?
Not as far as basics, no. I think we've got everything pretty much covered.
Again, the whole idea is that this is a fundamentals lesson, so I really want to keep it that way. Okay, so when working with keyframes, because as I said at the beginning, this lesson really is an introduction to keyframe animation. I just thought it would be nice to throw some of this beginner stuff out there. So keyframe animation. And at this point, everybody should have a very basic idea of what keyframe animation is, just simply recording values at given times on our timeline. Now, working with our animation that we've created through keyframe animation, we're going to be working in the channel graph, or excuse me, the channel editor. So what is the channel editor? Basically, it's going to give us that graph that I showed earlier that's going to have value and time, and then we're going to be able to see keyframes on it. And then we can come in here and we can start controlling the segments of the animation curve between each of our keyframes by adjusting the tangent handles on each of our different keyframes. So channel editor, I wanted to get that out of the way real quick. So that is a dialog that we will be using. There's also a dope sheet. We're not going to spend any time with it. I think maybe it'll take 2 seconds to just show it to you.
I'll jump into the dope sheet, show everybody. It's basically one of the options for the channel editor.
Yeah, exactly.
The channel editor has 3 different ways.
Yeah, working with the channel graph, working with the dope sheet, or on the timeline itself if you want to deal with stuff. But yeah, so I guess to be a little bit more specific, I'll do it this way then. And then I want to get everybody up to speed on my mentality. And here's my mentality. I just always view the channel editor just as a graph editor.
Yeah, really.
Because I always forget that the button's there unless suddenly I need to do some sort of timing control, and I'm not worried about my curve itself, not worried about the tangents and all. And for whatever reason, I'm not doing it down on my timeline, because you do have that ability as well. Then you go to a dope sheet. A dope sheet is a great way to just work with timing. That's all, just timing of your keyframes, your main poses, if you will. But so from Maya, from Max, I just always look at channel editor, dope sheet, or graph editor, dope sheet. You track view, dope sheet. You see what I'm getting at. So, but it really is one of 3 different things that we'll be visualizing, and we're going to take a look at the graph and the dope sheet as well as we work our way through here. So let's think. Anything else? They're going to hear the word scope.
Yes, they are.
They're going to hear the word scope a lot. To take a parameter and look at that parameter in our graph editor, basically we have to scope it.
Yes.
Once it's scoped, you can visualize it. If you unscope it, it's going to be removed out of our graph editor, as I shall now call it.
Yeah.
Because we're editing our curves in a graph.
Yes.
Now, you're going to find that by default, there are channels, or excuse me, parameters that are auto-scoped. That simply means that while working, if you were to hit the K key, just to drop a keyframe, what will happen is all parameters that are auto-scoped will automatically receive that keyframe. So what does auto... Well, and there's some certain circumstances that we can change that around, which we'll see in a few minutes. I'm just talking about by default.
By default, you drop in some form of node and you push K, all of the autoscope parameters will be given a key.
So what are the autoscoped channels? The autoscope channels or parameters are the parameters that are most likely to be animated on that particular type of node. So if we're dealing with an object, the most likely parameters that are going to be animated are going to be things like translate, rotate, scale, etc. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out. So there's a couple of things to keep in the back of your head as we jump over here into Houdini and begin working. So this is just a very fundamental introduction to animation inside of Houdini. And with that, let's go ahead and jump over into Houdini and start looking at some of this stuff.
Okay, so jumping into Houdini.
Okay, it's your show, Steve.
Fantastic. Let's take a look first at some of the options that we have for controlling our frame rate and our length of animation, since that was our first port of call when we're talking about how do we approach animation. Okay. So we can find them by getting to our global animation options, and they are accessed by clicking this button on the far right of the play bar. And our global animation options have our frames per second, and we talked about different formats having a different frames per second. Our start frame, our end frame, we can go in and change those. If we were to change those and click apply, we will get a pop-up. We can see that. Let's change this to 500. We'll get a pop-up that says, do you want to stretch your channels? If we say stretch channels, all of our animation that we have will be stretched to this new range. If we say no, then we're just going to extend it, but all of our keys will be left in place. I'm not going to really spend much time over anything else other than to mention real-time behavior. We have the ability to basically put Houdini in 2 different real-time modes. The first being that we always maintain our frames per second. So for every second that goes past, we will see, or at least progress through 24 frames of animation, but we might have to skip those to maintain that speed.
If it's a heavy scene and Houdini's having to do a lot of calculation, what's going to happen when you hit play, if you have this option selected, is that you're going to start dropping a lot of a lot of those frames, because it's whatever's necessary to keep us moving forward at 24 frames per second, or whatever your FPS is set to.
The other option ensures that we play every frame, and that's very useful for when we're doing our dynamic animations.
Oh, it's not useful.
It's essential.
It's
it's very essential.
If you're playing a dynamic simulation, basically what happens is the data from the previous frame is used in the calculation for the new data for the frame you're currently on. So if we start skipping frames, we end up with, well, garbage.
Yeah.
So your animation might begin okay and then quickly just explode and do very erratic things.
And also, next time we play it back, we may skip different frames, get a completely different simulation.
Precisely. So by telling Houdini to make sure that if in real-time mode we're going to play every single frame, then instead of 24 frames per second, depending on how heavy your scene is, we might be playing back at 5 frames per second or even slower, but Houdini is going to make sure that every single thing gets calculated. Then we advance, and then we can work on the information that was calculated in the previous frame for the new frame.
But if we have a really light scene, a scene that could maybe play back at 40, 50, 60 frames a second, we'll never go faster than this frames per second setting. I'm going to leave it on maintain real-time playback because when we're dealing with animation where it's not dynamic but it's keyframe based, we want to really see how the end result's going to look in terms of timing, and we're not so worried about seeing every single frame. And if you do want to see every single frame, you can go ahead and do a flipbook, which we'll see at a later point.
That sounds good.
Great. So I'm going to close this out.
With 500 frames?
We can have 500 frames if we really want. Let's set it back to 240. if you're going to be picky, you know.
240? Oh, I'm just kidding. Keep going.
What, did you want me to give it 2 frames? It'd be very, very boring animation.
Nah, 240 will work.
Sweet.
So let's start with something simple. All right, let's go. Let's create a sphere.
Cool.
If we just had a sphere bounce at the center or something.
Yeah, that sounds cool. So I'm going to control.
I think I'm going to have you put a bonus video in that we weren't planning in the next video, but I'll tell you about that later.
Okay.
Remember I made a hint about the jet? Maybe we can come back to the jet.
Okay, yeah, we can animate the jet.
All right.
Sweet.
So, but in this one, we're not going to do a lot of animation. It's just an introduction to keyframe.
Yeah, it's looking at some of the tools that we have and some of the ways that we can create keys, modify the curves, and all those kind of things.
Exactly. Okay.
Fantastic. So I'm going to control-click our sphere to drop a sphere in at the origin. And let's talk about keyframes. So at the current time, we're on frame 1. We've got our ball at the origin. And let's say that I want to animate this guy just in Y to make things nice and simple. We'll just make a very simple bouncing ball.
Okay.
So let's start this guy, I don't know, with a Y value that's somewhere up in the air. He's going to fall down and bounce on the ground. We've set our value. It's very important to basically set your time that you want a key to occur first, then set your value, then set a key. Then you'll change your time, set a new value, set your key. Because if we were to basically set our value, then change time, we're going to find that our value snaps back if we have animation on it to whatever the value should be at that time, and we'll lose our value change. And we'll see that in a second. So let's set a key on translate Y at this current frame of a current value of just over 5.5. And well, how do we go about doing that? Well, we can right click on the parameter, come down to channels and keyframes, and we can select set keyframe. The hotkey for that is Alt and left mouse button. And you're going to notice that, well, a couple of things. The first thing, this guy now changes to green because he's being controlled by something other than a constant value. And green is actually a very special color. It means there's a keyframe on this specific frame. And if we were to change from that frame, it's going to change to blue, indicating we're now tweening, we're now interpolating between different keyframes. Mm-hmm. Even though there is no other keyframe data currently, we're not sat on a specific keyframe. You also notice I will shrink this guy down just so it's very nice and clear. On frame 1, we have a green bar in our play bar on our timeline indicating we have a keyframe at 1. And we'll talk more about what we will and won't see down here when we talk about scope in a second. So let's boost this back up. So we've got a keyframe at frame 1. And let's say, I don't know, in about half of a second, so in about 12 frames, he's going to fall down onto the plane. So we can move him down and we can Alt left click to set another key. And there are other ways that we can set keys. I'm just going to jump aside from our ball to talk about those now, and then we can come back and look at finishing off this bouncing ball animation.
Well, even before we do that, take your range down there. Let's go ahead and make it so,
something like that?
Yeah, that looks pretty good.
Cool, so we can see we've got our 2
And let's just
keys.
show them that there is some interpolation already between the 2. Look at that.
And we'll see when we're on our first key, this guy's green. As we're tweening between them, he's going to be blue. We can click, basically this button goes to the previous keyframe, this one to the next keyframe. So we're on our final keyframe. This guy again is green.
Now check this out. This is only for the newbies. Look, we have animation. I bet you were looking at this. Look at this.
Yeah.
We have a parameter value changing over time. That's what you have to get your head around. Okay.
Sweet. So,
looking at other, well, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and just simply keep putting keys in with Alt left mouse button, and then we'll look at other ways of setting keys,
Sounds
and then
good.
we'll jump into the channel editor and actually manipulate the graph for this guy.
Excellent.
It's probably a good approach. There's a few things I want to talk about, and getting the order right in my head is very complicated.
That's what I was getting at the beginning of this video. There's a lot of things that can be covered in regards to animation in Houdini. It's very easy, easily can be a course all on its own.
Exactly, and just getting my head around how I want to demo it. So I'm going to finish off, since we started this guy, and you guys probably want to see the end of the bounce, even though at the beginning it's not going to look that great until we edit that curve.
Sure.
Let's just get that finished in.
Okay.
So we got our first bounce down, so let's Second bounce is going to be slightly shorter, not quite half a second to the peak of the bounce. So I'm just going to come slightly before our 24. And he's going to be slightly shorter in height than our original bounce. So the original bounce was around 5.5. Let's say this guy goes up to about 4, something like that. And we can Alt left key, Alt left
mouse. Point out
mouse.
that color difference that was just there.
Yeah, I'll do that on the next key.
Let's go ahead and do it on the next key.
So again, slightly under half a second. So there's from frame 22, let's go to frame 32. Now we can see currently we're blue because we're tweening. If we change our value, that value is going to go to a yellowy orange, and that means that we've made a change to an animated parameter to a channel, but we haven't yet committed that change. It's basically a change that is pending. So if we were to change our time right now, we'd lose this change. We can see that if we just scrub our time, we've lost that change. If we make the change again, it's pending a change. If we Alt left mouse, we're going to set a key, and that confirms that change. Something we'll look at in a minute is if we were to change, we'll look at it now. If we were to change, so many things I want to cover, man. So if we change a value on a keyframe, by default, we don't get the basically pending changes.
Yeah,
it will change that value, and we can see that if we now move, we're going back up to that value as opposed to down, and now we're going down. So let's quickly take a look at where that option is to turn that on and off, and then we'll continue. So if you can come up to Edit and Preferences, up underneath our animation preferences, we have the ability to turn on and off auto commit. And that basically, with auto commit on, if you make a parameter change on a keyframe, it will save it. With auto commit unchecked, that won't happen. It will turn, and we can see that if we accept, make a change, it's going to give us that pending change. If we were to tweak our timeline, we're going to go back to the existing change. So I'm just going to turn...
And by default, it is on.
Yes, by default, it's on. I'm going to turn auto commit back on.
Just because that is very convenient when animating.
Yeah, it is, because if you realize that you've got a keyframe that's wrong, you can go to that keyframe, change your parameters, and it will automatically commit those changes. You don't have to worry about setting keyframes
That's
again.
right.
So let's accept that. So we've got our first bounce. Let's create another couple of bounces, and we'll call it quits for the bounces. So I'm going to, again, slightly shorter, so say to around 40, slightly less amplitude, something like that. Alt left click, again, slightly shorter. Back down roughly onto the construction plane. I'm being fairly inaccurate with my Y values, but this is just a demonstration. Slightly shorter. And then we'll call this settling down. Something like that. So if we were to scrub, we see we've got a bounce and a smaller bounce and another bounce. We can turn on real time, which is going to, again, heed to whichever of these we've selected.
And again, in this particular case, the reason Steve's turning on real time is because this is such a simple scene that without real time on, Houdini will play it back as fast as Houdini can, which is going to be very fast.
Oh, yeah.
So we will have no idea of the timing if we were to do that.
Fantastic. And now if we play...
Kind of floaty. Let it play through again.
Yeah, that is...
There we go.
Kind of floaty. And we'll deal with that in a second when we come to looking at our channel and editing our channel in the channel editor.
I do want to point out to people that might be thinking, well, he just said it was a simple scene and slightly choppy. Also bear in mind that we are recording right now.
And we have Photoshop running as well.
Exactly.
So we're really pushing this computer.
And we're doing this on a laptop.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. And we're running 2 monitors off the laptop as well.
That's right, one a Cintiq tablet.
So... yeah, it's pretty much maxed out, that laptop. It's doing a good job.
It really is. It really is.
Fantastic.
Okay, so, next.
So, now let's jump aside and look at some other ways of setting keys.
I hope everyone doesn't mind. Can I send you in a different direction?
You sure can.
Let's follow through with the workflow.
Okay.
So, at the moment, they have the concept in their mind of setting some keys.
Sure.
Now, we have a floaty-looking animation.
We really do.
And what I mean by floaty is there is no real impact with the ground. It just kind of slows down.
It's like, well, the ground's coming, he slows down, and he's like, now I feel like flying again, and he speeds up.
Slow down right there, then come back up, and it results, and I mean, pulling fast, of course, makes it look like it's bouncing. But in essence, it slows down, and then turns around, and goes back up. This means that the animation curve that has been generated by default is basically easing out of a keyframe and easing into the next keyframe, then out of that keyframe. And that is where we're going to see a deceleration and then a slow acceleration. And we need to change that, because when a ball is dropped, gravity makes it, start going down. And when it comes into contact with the ground, if it's a bouncy ball, it's just smacking it immediately back in the other direction.
And we can see the comparison between these two very clearly when we come to look at our channel. So let's do that now.
Okay.
So there are a couple of ways to get to the channel editor. You can create a new tab or change any of these tabs into
by default there is one
channel editor. If you right click channel editor, graphs and dope sheet. I'm going to use a different approach. I'm going to right click.
So real quick, I just want to point out that by default we do have one that's already there.
Oh, fantastic. So we could switch over to this guy and we'd see our channel editor, and it's actually set to the dope sheet currently.
Go ahead and change back. We'll talk more about that in a minute.
Yeah, but the way that I like to get to channels is to scope a channel, and by scoping a channel, we automatically bring up a channel editor in a pop-up window looking at the channel that is scoped, because the channel editor only looks at scoped channels. And we'll take a minute later to talk in more depth about what scope means and how we go about scoping, unscoping, and the likes with channels. So we can right-click on our parameter, come down to channels and keyframes, and we can scope or scope append. We'll scope for now. We'll talk about scope append in a minute. And if we click this, we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to scope our channel, and mine was set to dope sheet. That could well have been from earlier. So your channel editor may well come in and look at the graph view on that tab as well.
By default, it will come in looking at the graph.
So we'll talk again about how you can switch between the different types in a second. This should be what you see by default, which is the graph view. So we've scoped our channel, and our channel is appearing down here in the channel list. Only scoped parameters, only scoped channels will appear down here. And we can see the curve for that channel. If we push the H key, we'll home up on that curve, and we can see why we've got floaty animation. Look at our curve. We ease out, we ease in, we ease out, we ease in. We can see very clearly we've got a very smooth motion. And that doesn't really reflect how a bouncing ball would act. As Jason pointed out a second ago, we need to hit the ground and instantly change direction upon that impact. And then we're going to,
widen up the top a little bit, because, gravity is starting to slow it down. Then it kind of lollygags for just a second. Then it begins to go back down.
Yeah, it takes over. Gravity takes over from the bounce, and it gets pulled back down to the ground. And then you're going to have another impact. Straight away, you change direction because that impact forces the ball to change direction. So let's deal with the impacts first, and then let's deal with changing the peaks of our curve so that we can give a more realistic feel to gravity.
Now, of course, we can see our keyframes down here with the frame that the guy's on and the value that it's set to. So again, frame, value. We can also see the tangent handles that I was talking about. And in a second, you're going to see the difference between them being solid and being not solid. Just dotted. And that's pretty much, I'll give you the mouse back. That's all I want to show just for a quick starter.
So to change how this curve comes into these keyframes are a low value. So obviously these are going to be when we're on the ground, and we can see a high peak and slightly lower peaks. To change how the curve comes in, we're going to need to change our tangents. But currently, these tangents are tied together in such a way if we change one, the other's going to move with us. So we could make this side come in with a peak, but then if we zoom in on our curve, we got some real nastiness going on down here. And we could make this guy leave with a peak. And we got nastiness going on down here now.
Go ahead and maximize the channel editor real quick. Now let's keep in mind, Steve, this is the first time that some of our beginners have ever seen the channel editor.
And I'm navigating it like a crazy person.
You're navigating. So they got space H from you a second ago.
Well, or just H, because we don't
just
need
H.
to...
That's such a habit to me, no matter what editor I'm in.
Yeah, if we're using, H and the mouse, space just comes habitually because of the way we navigate the viewer.
Because of toggling, into the view state.
And this, when I was actually navigating this a second ago, I was pushing space even though I didn't need to. So
you were.
So, how do we navigate this guy? Just like our 3D view, H homes up. Our right click will zoom, and if we move our mouse left and right, we zoom in time. If we move our mouse up and down, we're going to zoom in value. Middle click pans, and we can pan this guy around. And again, H2 home up. So I was panning with the middle mouse down to my keyframe and then zooming in on that keyframe with the right mouse button. So how do we go about breaking these guys such that we can control each one individually? Well, it's actually very simple. We can select the keyframe. I just marquee dragged over our keyframe. And we can come up here. Currently our handles are tied. We can untie them. We can do that in two ways. We could come to Edit, Tie, Untie. That will toggle between, and the hotkey for that is T. If we were to do that, you can see they go dotted now and they are untied. We'll do that again to show them tied. The other way is to use our selection of various tools down on the right hand side, options down on the right hand side. This button will tie and this button will untie tangents. If we click untie, we see them again. So now we can select this tangent and move him separately. Currently the value of the tangents are still moving together, but you can see that their angles are individual. They're on an individual basis, which is fantastic because now we can make this curve come in, bang, it changes direction. We could do the same thing here. So let's grab this guy, let's push T, the hotkey, to tie and untie, and do the same for this guy. And down here, select that keyframe T. And then finally, we could just move this guy since he is the
final one.
Keyframe. If we were to continue this animation, we need to come in and untie them probably to alter this guy. So we've dealt with coming into the bounces.
Go ahead and home it up just so that, yeah, there we go, it looks better.
But our peaks are still kind of messy. They're kind of not as wide. They don't take as much time as we'd like, and we can easily change those. We don't need to worry about untying our handles because we do want a smooth curve that matches in terms of tangents going into and out of the keyframe. But we can change the weighting on the handles, and you can see as we change the weighting, our curve gets more or less biased towards this keyframe as opposed to the other keyframe. So let's just boost our weighting slightly, and you can see instantly the shape of our curve changing. Let's boost this guy out. Let's just boost him slightly. We're obviously not going for perfection here. And you can hopefully see the entire way the correspondence between our time and our value. So now we slowly accelerate into our bounce and we bounce. And then we're going to slowly get decelerated by gravity. We'll hold and then we bounce. We hold, we bounce, we hold, and we bounce. And now if we just minimize this down and close out that editor, if we now play back our animation, much nicer. Fantastic. So that gives you a very quick overview of a workflow for working with keyframes, and now we can take a more detailed look at some of the other ways you can set keyframes, how we can go about modifying keyframes, and how we can go about removing keyframes. And to do that, I'm going to create a new object, so it's nice and clean, has no information.
In case we want to come back to this one for whatever reason, just turn the visibility flag off.
Sure.
And then we just throw another
Fantastic. I'm going to create a box this time.
Ooh, a box. I never saw it coming.
I was almost going to click on sphere. And
I saw you thinking about it.
Yeah, I decided to go with a box, give him a turn. So how else could we go about creating keyframes? Well, we could create keyframes on the different transformation parameters. We have translations, rotations, and scales. And we know the hotkey to get the tools for translation is T. To get the tool for rotation is R, and to get the tool for scaling is E. Well, if we use Shift in combination with those letters, we create keyframes on the channels that correspond to those three tools. So Shift and T will create keyframes on our translations. Shift and R creates keyframes on our rotations. Shift and E creates keyframes on our scales. So there's a very quick way if you're working just with translations and you've made changes in X, Y, and Z. Shift T will drop down a keyframe at your current frame with the current translation parameters. So that could be very useful. Let's undo that to get rid of all of those guys. Another way of keying parameters, we talked about scoped and unscoped channels. If you push K, the scoped channels, current scope channels of your current selected node will be keyed.
And once again, by default, those channels that are auto-scoped are going to be the parameters that are most likely to be animated.
Exactly, and by default on a geometry node, translates, rotates, and scales are auto-scoped. So let's take a second, let's talk about scoping, and let's talk about how we can change if a parameter is auto-scoped and how we can change if a parameter is scoped or not. So let's bring up, and we can go to Windows, and we can grab a channel editor in a floating window. And we can see that we've got our rotates, scales, and translates down here in our channel list because these are the currently scoped parameters. Now, we didn't right-click and tell it to scope these parameters. These guys are scoped by default. They are auto-scoped. And if we were to let go of our object and come back and select that object, whichever parameters are set to be auto-scoped will be scoped when we reselect the object. So how do we go about changing if parameters are scoped, and how do we go about changing if parameters are auto-scoped? Well, let's deal with scope first because we can see which parameters are scoped down here in our channel list. To unscope some parameters, we simply select those parameters. You can use Control and left click, or Shift and left click, or simply left click to select combinations of parameters. I'm selecting the scales here. If you right click on those, we can say unscope. And we'll notice
that removes it out of your channel list, but does not take off the auto scope.
Exactly. So now if we deselect this object and come back, boom, scales are back. How do we add new parameters into the scoping? Well, we can right-click on a parameter, come down to Channels and Keyframes, Scope Append. If we said scope channels like before, that basically unscopes any existing channels and will only scope our newly selected parameters. If we scope append channels, that's going to leave our currently scoped channels still in place and add these guys into the current scoping. If we click scope append, now our pivots come in and join the party down here in our channel list. Another way of adding channels, if you have a channel list open, we can just simply left click on a parameter name and drag down here. And we can add, now we've got our uniform scale down here, so he's scoped. But again, these are just the scoped channels. If we deselect our object and reselect, our auto scope comes back into play. So how do we change our auto scope? That's very simple. We can right click on an already auto scoped parameter. We can come down to Channels and Keyframes and we can say unset auto scope. Now that was on the translates. If we deselect our object and come back, our translates are no longer in there. And say for whatever reason we wanted uniform scale to be auto scoped. We can right click on uniform scale, Channels and Keyframes, set auto scope. And now if we deselect our object and come back, now uniform scale is an auto-scoped channel, auto-scoped parameter.
This could have been very handy when animating your ball, where if the only parameter that will be changing was your translate Y, you could have un-auto-scoped everything.
Yeah, and only auto-scoped at translate Y.
That's right.
And if we went anywhere else and came back to our ball, only translate Y would be auto-scoped, which would mean we simply need to deselect and reselect our ball. Translate Y would appear here. Now, scoping has another implication in Houdini, and that is that when we have our parameters scoped, we can see their keyframes down here on the track bar, on the play bar, on the timeline. If they're not scoped, we won't see those keyframes, and we can demonstrate that very quickly. I'll just create a new object to keep things nice and clean. So let's create a keyframe on X that changes and a keyframe on Y at different frames that changes, and we can show difference between scoping each one. So I'm going to Alt left click translate X on frame 1 and jump to frame 48 and just move this guy, and we can see with our box actually selected we've got a keyframe on 48 and a keyframe on 1. Why are we seeing these? Because our translates are auto scoped by default. I'm going to come to frame 24 just so that there's a difference in timing. I'm going to create a key on Y, and then I'm going to come to frame 72 and create a new key on frame 72, and we can see, because our translates are scoped, because they're auto-scoped, that we can see all of these keyframes. Now let's come in and change our scoping. Let's right-click on Translate X, Channels and Keyframes, and scope this guy, and that's going to replace all of our other scoping. We only see Translate X here. Let's get rid of the channel editor. We only see our Translate X keyframes down on our play bar. Let's scope our Translate Y. We can do that with the Shift middle click is going to scope channels. Again, channel editor pops up showing Translate Y, but more importantly, now only our Translate Y keyframes are visible. And we've seen from auto-scoping, if we deselect and reselect, we can now see everybody.
That's right, and this is very handy for down on the timeline like that, because you can manipulate these keys down the timeline, and once you start throwing a lot of keys in there on different parameters, and it's parameters that are all scoped, then it really becomes difficult to use our timeline down there for manipulating keys, because you don't necessarily know what key you're manipulating.
Yeah, exactly. Fantastic. So we will come back in a second to how we can modify keys on the timeline, as well as in the channel editor and as well as in our dope sheet. But I want to take a second, since we're dealing with creating keyframes here, and talk about auto key, because auto key can be very handy. So auto key is enabled two ways, and they actually are the exact same option. It's just one is a visual button for turning on that option, and one is a checkbox in a menu.
But they are tied together.
They are tied together. So this is the button. It's the auto key button. And the menu, for those who are interested, up under Edit, Preferences and Animation, we have the auto key checkbox here. They are the exact same thing. If we check this now and click Accept, our button toggles on. Fantastic. So I'm going to delete this guy out and create a new box just so everything is nice and clear. So how does auto key work? Well, auto key will automatically create a keyframe on an existing channel, and that's an important thing. We'll come back to it in a second. When we change the value of that channel, when we change the value of that parameter. So what I said there that is really important is it's on an existing channel. So if you haven't created any animation on a parameter, if you haven't created your first keyframe, you don't have a channel, you only have a parameter. Thus, if we change our translate Y now, we don't get a keyframe because we don't have an existing channel. If we Alt left click to create a keyframe, we now have a channel on translate Y. If we come to a different frame, say 48, with auto key enabled, if we change this value, look at that, we've created a keyframe. So it's not waiting and basically pending a keyframe. We have created a keyframe because auto key will automatically create keyframes when we change the value of a parameter.
I work with different applications, and this is a great time for me to step up and just look kind of dumb. Back up under here, I'm just curious about something. Edit, if we come down to Preferences and down to Animation, inside of here, let's see, where did I, or was it in another location?
What are you searching for? And I may be able to help you.
Or, hang on, I could have swore it was up under this. Additional keyframes. Set additional first key at frame.
Ah, yes.
This guy right here. So if he's set to... well,
let's set him to something that's actually in our range of frames. Something like 10?
So, yeah, 10
sound cool? And we accept this guy. What's this going to do is... if we were to create a keyframe in any shape or form, we're going to automatically also create a keyframe at the specified frame. So we're on frame 56. I'm going to key translate X.
And at 10, we should see...
so we're going to see a key obviously here at 56, but keep an eye around here for frame 10. Boom.
Good. So I'm not crazy. So
you're not crazy.
I just wanted to add on, because what it was sounding like just a second ago when you were explaining it is that you always have to put your first keyframe down and then auto key will pick up from there. And that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah,
but the problem here is it wasn't set, and by default, I believe it's set to 0. But we start with frame 1, so it looks like you have to have that first key manually created.
Exactly,
because that 0 falls outside the range of your animation. If it does, it's not going to create.
But you notice that if we change a parameter that doesn't have a channel, say translate Z, it's still not going to create that key for us.
Yeah, not if we. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Cool. So that's auto key. It can be very useful.
Yeah, just pointing out that we don't have to put that first one down.
To have a
beginning
keyframe created. But you do have to create a keyframe to create a channel for auto key to actually do anything.
Precisely.
Fantastic. So I'm going to turn auto key off. And we've talked about auto key. We've talked about scope. So let's talk about modifying our keyframes.
Okay.
And there's a whole wealth of ways for doing it.
Let's just cover a few of them.
So let's talk about the play bar, or our timeline. Let's talk about the channel graph, and let's talk about the dope sheet.
Okay.
Fantastic. So let's, since we're here, talk about the play bar. We can move and we can scale our keyframes in the play bar. And to do that, we first need to make a selection of a frame range to work with. And we do that by holding the Shift key and left mouse clicking in our play bar, and we'll drag out a selection. With this selection made, if we middle click on the middle section of this selection, we're going to move that selection and any keyframes that are within it. If we middle click on the end, we're going to scale from the end. If we middle click on this end, we'll scale from the end. To make a new selection, we can shift click somewhere else. To get rid of our selection, if we right click on the play bar, we should be able to clear selection.
Very nice.
So that's working with the play bar to move keyframes. Let's also look at the channel editor. So I'm just going to simply shift middle click translate Y so that we get a single parameter scoped H to home up. When dealing with keyframes, we're looking at these little vertical bars in the channel editor, and we can grab one of those bars. With that selected, we can move the keyframe in time by simply left-clicking and dragging. You'll notice if I move up and down, we cannot change value. We can only change time. And by default, these are set to snap to exact frames. If we were to wish to change the value, we'd need to select the basically inner square part of a keyframe, and now if we left-click and drag, excuse me, we now change it in value and not in time.
Right.
If you want to change in value and time, you can simply hold the control key, and that will allow you to change in value and time.
I'd like to also point this out. Go ahead and maximize the channel editor if you don't mind. At the bottom, you'll see that we've got frame and value as well. So if you have precise numbers that you would like to enter, there's no reason to drag over. You can just come down there and say, take that frame forward.
So let's move him to 13. Let's change the value to 4.
Yeah, sounds great. Yeah, perfect.
Awesome. And we also have the dope sheet. So top left of our channel editor lets us switch between a graph, a spreadsheet, and the dope sheet. The dope sheet is going to look very similar to our play bar, and we make selections in a very similar way to our play bar. If we left click and drag, you don't have to hold shift. In this case, we'll drag out a selection. Now, if we left click on this selection, we simply move the range of the selection that we've grabbed. Left clicking on the end moves the range. Notice these keys aren't being affected. Middle click, on the other hand, will actually affect the keyframes. Middle click on this guy moves the keyframes, and middle click on the end will scale, and likewise middle click on the other end. To see the other end, we do need to boost our range. Again, this works the exact same way as the play bar. We can scale from the other end. So we've looked at modifying our keyframes now, and we've looked at modifying our interpolation. So all that's really left to do is looking at removing keyframes. Okay. So we can close out the channel editor. Now, there's a difference between removing a keyframe and removing a channel. To remove a keyframe, we need to be on a specific keyframe, and we can do that by clicking the move to next or move to previous keyframe buttons down here. We can also get to that through the right-click menu for a particular parameter if you want to jump to a keyframe of a specific parameter. If we right-click on that parameter, come down to channels and keyframes, we can step to previous or step to next key. When we're on that keyframe, we can remove the keyframe by right-clicking, coming down to channels and expressions, remove keyframe. That does have the shortcut control left mouse. So if we remove the keyframe, you'll notice we've removed the keyframe, but we do still have a channel created, which does still have at least a keyframe on it. If we want to remove the channel, which means we remove all keyframes and all animation on that channel, and it will basically assume whichever value we're at currently. So I'm going to remove the channel for translate Y, and it currently has a value of 4.2, even though that isn't on a keyframe. We can right-click on the channel, come down to channels and keyframes, and it's not on that menu, but you can right-click on a channel and come down to delete channels.
Yeah.
Wow, yeah.
I was wondering what you were doing.
Me too, for a second. Yeah, you can come down to delete channels. It has a very similar hotkey to deleting just a keyframe. Instead of control left-click, it's control shift left-click. So yeah, just to, because of the confusion there. For deleting a keyframe, right-click, channels and keyframes, remove keyframe. For deleting a channel, we just simply right-click and come down to delete channels. Excellent. And you'll see me especially use this a lot when we're dealing with expressions, because you can delete an expression by deleting a channel, because when you create an expression, you also have a channel created for that expression.
Exactly.
So let's delete that channel, and that will remove any animation on translate Y, and notice our value was the value that we were at when we deleted that channel. So I mean, with that, we've taken a fairly broad overview of a lot of the basics of keyframe animation. Was there anything that you'd like to add?
That was the goal of this particular video. Like I said, we're going to have another video that was not originally going to do, so I'll call it a bonus video. And I'll just have you set up some animation for the jet. Cool. Where the jet's going to follow a path, and maybe we'll fire off the missiles. And since
that'd be a nice little challenge.
Yeah. Since there's some parenting in there, that'll be a rig. So... yeah. All right. Cool. Well, with that, again, this was just an introduction to keyframe animation. Keep your eye out at 3D Buzz for other videos that we'll be coming out with, or products where we'll be spending more time talking about specifics of animation. And that will conclude this video. Thank you all.